Justinian's reign was eventful and controversial, and it was clear that whoever came after him had a pretty tall task, whether they decided to imitate Justinian or go in a different direction. And the man who took over for Justinian was his nephew Justin II, who would quickly prove himself to be unworthy of taking up that great challenge. Just like his uncle Justin I, Justinian I also had no direct male heir, and he had two prominent nephews who had a lot of imperial experience, and confusingly, both of them were named Justin. However, of those two, one was a general, the son of Germanus, and he was not present in the capital, whereas the other was the head of the palace and had the most access to Justinian. So, not surprisingly, the one with the most access to Justinian ended up winning out. And here's how it happened. There was an official named Callinicus, and he was the only person with Justinian at the time of his death, and he reported to all of the bodyguards and other imperial officials that when Justinian died, his last words were that the son of Vigilantia, not the son of Germanus, would become the next emperor of Rome. Of course, they called themselves Romans. They did not call themselves Byzantines yet. Fun fact I might have mentioned once or twice. Now, so the thing is, though, Callinicus, the chief of the bodyguards named Tiberius, and the current patriarch in 565 were all people who had some tie to the man who would become Justin II. They had experienced his patronage in one form or another. So, when they all agreed that Justin II should be the emperor rather than his cousin, the son of Germanus, that's not all that surprising, and some people have thought that this was a little bit of a cabal. Well, I won't go too far into that. There's not a lot of evidence to work with one way or the other. Suffice it to say, though, that everyone who agreed that Justin II was the legitimate Justin did benefit from their decision. There's also a report that there was a pact between the two Justins and that they were close, and that they agreed that whichever one of them became emperor, the other one would be his right-hand man and the number one person in the empire aside from the emperor. Well, Justin II decided to honor that pact at first. He invited his cousin to visit the capital so they could discuss things, and then he immediately had him jailed and later exiled and then murdered while he was in exile to Egypt. So, that didn't really work out, and Justin II did not honor that pact, assuming that it did exist, which it possibly could have just been made up by a later source hostile to Justin II to make him appear shifty, who knows. One interesting fact about Justin II is that he is the first emperor of Byzantium to be a native Greek speaker rather than a native Latin speaker, and so far as we can tell, his Latin was not terribly good, and that would be the case for all of his successors as well, and eventually Byzantine emperors would no longer speak Latin at all. Justinian was the last of the emperors to be a native Latin speaker. So this is one of the key moments in the transition between what we might call the Eastern Roman Empire and Byzantium, if we are dedicated to upholding that historical boundary. Now, a superficial look at a map would show you that all of Justinian's conquest had held, and you would think that the Byzantines would be in good shape. However, not all was as well as it appeared if you just look at lines and colors on a map. Justin II knew he was in trouble, and while he had the personal ambition to imitate his predecessor and uncle, he really didn't have the resources to do much. So first of all, Justinian left the empire broke. He spent all of the money stashed by Anastasius, so Justin II didn't really have a cash reserve to play with. The imperial armies were stretched thin. Originally, the army was only designated to defend the areas in the dark orange. There had been no real expansion, so far as we can tell, of the Byzantine army. It had just been spread further when it was extended into Africa, Italy, and Spain. In addition to that, on the traditional frontiers of the Danube and the frontier with Persia, there were increasing threats there. There was a fragile peace in Italy, Spain, Africa, Persia, and the Balkans, all of the areas of potential conflict. So there was a potential fivefold threat. So Justin's solution is to act aggressively. Now, why does he do that, and how? Let's find out. In order to provide armies for Belisarius and Narses and their expeditions to Africa, Italy, and Spain, Justinian had really had to withdraw a lot of field units from the frontier with Persia and the frontier on the Danube. And to try to make up for that, what he had done was pay subsidies to groups like the Avars and the Persians in order to keep them appeased and keep them from attacking him. Well, Justin II decided that he was going to be a true Roman and refused to pay any subsidy to any barbarian in order to keep them out. The problem is the idea of paying subsidies was one that went back quite a long way. I think at the beginning of this course I talked about Severus Alexander paying a subsidy to someone to keep them away. Now, while there were some Romans who regarded this as cowardly, there were practical advantages to doing something like this, and Justin II was completely blind to those advantages. So one possible advantage and one motive is that you could save money doing this, and Justin certainly did save some money, as we'll see in the future. Now, this immediately leads to a Balkan conflict because one of Justin's other moves in the Balkans is to switch up his alliances. So rather than backing the weaker Lombards against their other neighbors, he decides to side with the Gepids. The Lombards and the Avars destroy the Gepids, and then the Lombards attack Byzantine-held Italy, possibly as a form of revenge and possibly because it was vulnerable. We'll talk about the history of the Lombards in the future, but suffice it to say for now, this is a major foreign policy disaster, and the fragile peace that had been established in Italy at the end of Justinian's reign is shattered, and the Byzantines will lose control of over half of Italy from this invasion. Now, this does cause a lot of tension with Persia. The conflict is not immediate, but there are 50 years or so of near constant on and off warfare that result from the end of the subsidy, and we'll discuss those consequences and Sassanid Persia in more detail in other videos. About 9 years into his reign, around the year 574, Justin began experiencing fits of insanity, and those would manifest themselves when he would start biting people at court. And these fits were getting worse and worse over time. At a certain point, from some cause, possibly related, possibly not, he also became wheelchair bound. And there are stories, most likely made up, that he actually ate a few of the people at his court. During his more, collected moments, his more lucid moments, he realized that he had a problem, and along with his wife Sophia, he was determined to appoint an imperial colleague so that his illness would not doom his empire. If you look at Justin II's coins, you wouldn't be all that surprised that Sophia, his wife, was the first person that he turned to for help. She is the first Byzantine empress to appear alongside her husband on an imperial coin, but not the last. She is the one who finally persuades her husband to abdicate real power because his mental condition is growing progressively worse. And while Justin at first was sort of inclined to choose someone from within his own family, eventually Sophia helps him decide to choose his friend and bodyguard chief Tiberius as the Caesar instead of a relative because he would be better at the job. And then Sophia and Tiberius would serve as co-regents for Justin II from 574 to 578. And while Justin would technically remain in charge for all practical intents and purposes, 574 to 578 were really more part of Tiberius's reign than Justin's. So how do we gauge Justin's legacy? For this, I'm only looking at the years 565 to 574, since the last 4 years of his administration were a time when he was clearly incapacitated and not making decisions. So, by choosing Tiberius, on the one hand, he does ensure a successful and peaceful transition of power, which is never a guaranteed thing in any monarchy, particularly one with a Roman origin where all of the emperors are effectively military dictators at heart. So that's something. However, it does end his family's dynasty. So from the perspective of the family of Justinian, this is a failure. Now, because of his own problems and also the decisions he does and doesn't make, he not only fails to resolve the existing problems that he inherited, but then further exacerbates them by antagonizing the people on his frontiers who already have him at a disadvantage. Now, until the year 574, when he has control of finances, he does build up the imperial savings quite a bit, and that's a pretty good thing to do. However, he also tries to intervene in theological affairs, and he fails pretty spectacularly. He is not successful at that at all, and more or less everyone rejects his ideas. We have the general impression that he was an unpopular ruler. Certainly he wasn't popular with the church leaders who rejected his religious ideas for compromise, and he did also inspire a little bit of ire by provoking barbarian attacks by ending the subsidies. So we assume the common people were against him as well, but we don't quite really know that because they don't really leave written records. So anyway, Justin II, if I had to grade him, I would give him a D. He was a below average emperor, and he failed to resolve any of the problems that his predecessors left him. The only reason I don't give him an F is because, one, he ensured a peaceful succession, and two, he had the self-awareness to recognize his own mental illness and take appropriate actions to protect people around him from the consequences of that illness. When Justin II lost his grip on reality, he handed over the reins of the empire to his old friend and current bodyguard captain Tiberius. Tiberius later went on to become Tiberius II Constantine and ruled officially as emperor from 378 to 382. This is his story. The friendship between Justin II and Tiberius dates back to when both men were serving under Justinian. They were on a campaign together in the Balkans, and they became fast friends, and that is why Justin eventually appointed Tiberius to be the head of the excubators under him. You obviously want to really entrust your safety to someone you trust, and Tiberius was someone he deemed completely trustworthy. Now, Tiberius was also known for being very good looking, even as an older guy, and he apparently was someone who the Empress Sophia found very attractive, at least if our sources are to be believed. Now in 574, Sophia prevailed upon her husband to choose regents to rule in his stead since Justin had slipped mentally. So he chose Sophia, his wife, and also his good friend Tiberius. Sophia was the one who convinced him to skip over his own relatives and go straight to Tiberius because she thought he was hot, maybe, or just because he was much more experienced and better able to run the empire. Who knows? Obviously, Sophia did not write the history, so her motives maybe got a little bit simplified at the expense of what may have been a very intellectually motivated decision on her part. We don't know. Now, there's a 99% chance, because of all of that I just said, that Empress Sophia and Tiberius were having an affair, at least for the 4 years that Tiberius was Caesar under Justin II. And by the way, he officially became Caesar several months after his appointment as regent, when Justin II was having another moment of lucidity and he looked into what Tiberius was doing with his power, and he was really pleased, so he decided to further entrust Tiberius with more power, so he made him a Caesar, which is basically a junior emperor, if you'll recall. And that's why I chose to use the graphic from the Tetrarchy, because in that arrangement you had a senior emperor, the Augustus, and a junior emperor, the Caesar, and this relationship really calls that back. And I think the image of the two working in concert and being like brothers is fitting, considering the relationship between Justin II and Tiberius, which apparently was not a relationship that was not undermined by Tiberius being with Justin's wife. if that was the case, which I assume it was. When Justin died, Tiberius, promised Sophia, at her urging, that he would leave his own wife and marry her. Therefore, she would remain as empress and he would become emperor. Seems like a pretty good deal for both. Well, Tiberius changed his mind at the last minute after Justin was dead, and he decided to take the title of Tiberius II Constantine and then make his own wife empress, and that led to Sophia's influence waning, as now she was just a former empress, and this put Tiberius in sole command of the empire. So now that he has full power, what does he do with it?
One positive thing as a person trying to teach about Tiberius II is that he was Caesar for 4 years and then Augustus for 4 years, so it makes it pretty easy to divide his foreign policy into two parts. Nice and easy right down the middle, 4 years and 4 years. So basically what he does as Caesar is one of his first moves is to restore the policy that Justin II had ended by paying subsidies to keep peace. And his intention is to get the Persians to, stop attacking so he can get enough troops in the east in order to then deter them militarily. So he does that. He also makes an alliance with the Franks to attack the Lombards. Under Justin II, the Lombards had invaded Italy, and they were taking more and more territory. So what he does is he wants the Franks to hit the Lombards from behind. It also helps that the Franks are fellow Orthodox Christians, so they see eye to eye. However, the plan gets foiled because his general in Italy gets completely defeated and dies in the battle, and that causes the Lombards to take over more territory in Italy. And then, the Franks at that point kind of back off from their war aims because at that point it had become useless. He has two chief generals in the east fighting Persia. One of them is Justinian, who was the son of Justin, son of Germanus, who did not become emperor. And his other general is a much more important guy named Maurice, who we'll see a lot of in the future. There's one point when he was Caesar where Justinian, the same guy who's the general, was trying to plot with Sophia to overthrow Tiberius as Caesar, but Tiberius agreed to pardon him after he paid him a lot of gold. A nice bribe. I'm sorry for killing you or trying to kill you. Here's a big sum of money. I guess that works. And needless to say, after that attempt, Justinian stopped being an important general, and then Maurice was more in power than ever on the eastern frontier. So in 578, the long-suffering Justin II dies, and now Tiberius is effectively emperor in his own right. Well, he continues his general policy of restoring traditional Byzantine foreign policy. So he restores subsidies to the Avars in order to try to deter them, but this is ineffective because they are able to penetrate the frontier almost immediately and cause some real problems. Now, his real emphasis as both Caesar and Augustus was on the eastern frontier, especially on the Persian and Armenian frontier. That's where he has his best general, Maurice. He has his biggest armies. And probably to get those armies up to snuff, he might have stripped away some of the units that were supposed to be in the Balkans. At least that's how it would appear based on what happens. He also has some successes in North Africa. His generals there win some battles against the Berbers. Those victories are not very long-lived, and North Africa will never really be what it once was, and we'll see that under Tiberius' successor, things continue to decline in North Africa. But for now, things are looking good. In 579, there was enough frontier stability that on both the Balkan front and the Persian front that Tiberius was able to take his new units and try to get things back to normal in Italy and Spain. So he sends more troops to both fronts. However, probably while those troops are still on the boats sailing to their new destination, the city of Sirmium falls to the Avars in 579, and Sirmium is the main obstacle between the Roman frontier and the Balkans. At least the interior of the Balkans, where you can raid and get a decent amount of booty and whatnot. So when that falls, the people subject to and allied with the Avars, called the Slavs, began to heavily settle the Balkans. That's something we'll talk about in more detail going forward. I believe next week, actually. So, despite the fact that he'd already tried and failed once, General Justinian, now several years removed from his last command, tries another plot against Tiberius. This fails, not surprising. So he pays money again to get out of it. That works again somehow. Tiberius pardons him. And then he dies in 582, the same year as Tiberius himself, of natural causes, not because he was executed. As for Tiberius II's domestic policy, it's, safe, if not quite kind, to say that he didn't really have any ideas. His one major policy initiative, which is fairly unique, is that every year as Augustus, starting with his accession and going to his last year in 582, he handed out 7,200 pounds of gold a year to the population of Constantinople. This is in an effort to court popularity with the people. Maybe he looked back at the time of Justinian, 40, 50 years before, and he said, hey, those riots can get pretty scary, so maybe if I just make sure that people love me, there's no way that one of these riots could get out of control and could be suborned by a bunch of aristocrats trying to overthrow me. So maybe a smart move, but maybe not. And he also maybe was fearing that the population was still loyal to the Justinian dynasty, so he made lots of gestures to show his own fealty to that dynasty. For instance, not killing the general Justinian twice, probably a pretty good sign that Tiberius was trying to signal that he had some sort of affection for that family. He did relax taxes, which can also be interpreted as a way to try to gain some aristocratic and popular support. Obviously, a lot of people tend to like it when they pay less taxes. And he did do a little bit of building. It's not really clear that he did anything too extravagant. He might have just repaired a few buildings. He might have built a couple of minor churches, something like that. Anyway, it's nothing too big or grand, but he did a little bit of building. So, despite the fact the empire was not doing all that hot, it was still chugging along, albeit at a subpar rate. So, Tiberius has created a little bit of a dilemma for modern historians trying to read his mind. Usually when you marry your daughter to someone, you're signaling your intention that that person should succeed you. And Tiberius decided to marry one of his two daughters to the general Maurice, and one to Germanus, the son of Justinian, who tried to kill him twice. So you would think that maybe he's trying to establish two emperors. And there has been a theory that maybe he wanted Germanus to go west while Maurice would hold the east. Maurice would hold what we know as Byzantium, and then maybe Germanus would go hold, Italy, what they had in Spain and North Africa, and maybe he was trying to reestablish the Western Empire as a formal thing. However, that's not what ended up happening. Maurice ends up getting the whole thing, and it looks like there was never any real question of Germanus being emperor. It looks like he and Maurice got along fine, and Germanus, or at least someone named Germanus, is later named as a patrician. If it is the same guy, then it just means that he would have had to have gotten that office from Maurice, meaning that they were cool with each other. Now, Tiberius dies at a time when the empire is once again in a crisis. There had been another Persian invasion, while also he was doing a negotiation with the Avars. So in 582, he had ceded the frontier city of Sirmium formally to the Avars, 3 years after the fact. They demolished the city, so there's no way the Byzantines could retake it and reestablish that frontier in the same way that it had been before. And at the same time, though, Maurice did check another major Persian invasion and win a big battle, a battle that kept the peace for about 20 years. However, Maurice had to rush home to Constantinople because it looks like Tiberius was poisoned and he died. It's also possible that he just was old. He wasn't a young man, as I mentioned earlier. So, but, it makes a better story if he's poisoned. So let's just go with that. He was poisoned, but it took a long time for the poison to kill him, and he entrusts the empire to Maurice. In assessing the reign of Tiberius II, I'm looking not only at his short time as Augustus from 578 to 582, but also his years as Caesar when he was, for all practical intents and purposes, already the senior emperor, 574 to 578. All of this whole entire 8-year period will be considered in this. And just like a lot of other emperors from this period, his main problem is that there are some fundamental issues facing the Byzantine Empire, such as overextension and an inability to gain some sort of permanent settlement on any frontier. He doesn't really address any of that, so the major problems that continue to plague his empire are the same as they were when he took power. He's competent, he runs the state relatively well, but he's uninspired, and he doesn't really show a great deal of enthusiasm for tackling great big problems. He does show some loyalty to the Justinianic dynasty, and he certainly demonstrates mercy in his dealings with the general Justinian. This probably helped him to maintain his power, even though he was not a member of that dynasty. And it also gave him enough legitimacy that he could appoint Maurice, who was also not a member of the Justinianic family. He apparently was reasonably well liked. This is a saint's image, and supposedly this was one of the saints from an earlier period who they didn't really have an appearance for. They didn't know what the guy looked like, so they just basically painted Maurice. Or not Maurice, but Tiberius II. And they said, well, you're a really good emperor and a really good guy, so, this saint was a good guy. We'll just assume that he looked kind of like you. It'd be a fitting thing. One thing you can say for Tiberius II, as with many of his 6th century predecessors, is that he did manage to choose a worthy successor, and he was able to ensure a smooth transition of power. And he gave the empire to Maurice, who was probably the best emperor of this period, at least until Heraclius. But there's a lot of controversy about Heraclius, which we'll get to in due time. Today we're going to look at the life of one of the most important of the Byzantine emperors, Maurice, who ruled from 582 to 602. One of the primary things that makes Maurice important is that he is more or less the archetype for all of the emperors to come after him, in that he is not only the emperor, but also the chief general of the empire. To recapitulate what I said about Maurice during my video on Tiberius II, and then to add to it, I'd like to talk about how he came to be emperor. So, under Tiberius II, Maurice was his primary general on the Eastern Front. For about 8 or so years, he was the main field commander of Byzantium's largest army facing the Persians, and he was largely successful. I don't think he lost very many battles during that time. So when Tiberius II was getting older and more sickly, he named Maurice as his Caesar, and he did not live long beyond that point. So in 582, Maurice is proclaimed Augustus, and one of his first moves is to marry Tiberius' daughter. That gives him a greater claim to legitimacy. There were still many members of the Justinian family around, and at this point it would be a good idea to be as legitimate as possible, and marrying Tiberius' daughter was one way to do that. Probably the oddest thing about Maurice's reign is that whereas most of his predecessors really struggled when they had to deal with foreign policy challenges, Maurice was more or less the exact opposite. He excelled at dealing with foreign problems, but he really struggled when it came to managing his domestic affairs. Now, part of this was not his fault. After the Nika riots, Justinian had greatly rolled back the privileges of the Blues and the Greens, and the whole massacre under Belisarius had really curbed their appetite for excess. However, this is about 50 years later at this point, and these guys are back to their normal antics, the Blues and the Greens especially being the two most powerful factions, and they're back to faction fighting, murdering rivals, and there's also just urban unrest and crime in general, possibly facilitated by these clubs. It's not really entirely clear. But one weird thing about this is that these problems pervade not only Constantinople, but all Byzantine cities to some degree. So this is basically a time of lots of crime. And there are no organized police forces in the medieval world to deal with some of this stuff. So Maurice never really deals with these problems in any kind of depth, and he spends most of his time in the field commanding armies, so he, more or less avoids the problem as much as he can. However, this general spirit of discontent was spread throughout society. It wasn't just in the cities, and this infected the army as well. Of course, some people in the army would come from the cities, and the attitudes of the cities are normally not, completely divorced from the attitudes of the countryside. So this means that we have a lot of soldiers in the army now who are not really all that eager to follow orders, and they are able and willing to use violence to back up their will to be disobedient. So that will present a major challenge to Maurice, the soldier emperor. Earlier I mentioned that Maurice becomes the archetype for what a Byzantine emperor is. And the main thing that we normally associate with Byzantine emperors from the High Empire is that they led their troops in the battle in person. Maurice is the first person to do that since Theodosius I. It had been 200 years since an emperor had led his men in the battle. And this means that now the age of the palace princes like Arcadius and Honorius and Justinian, that age is over. And from this point forward, the expectation will be that the Byzantine emperor and the princes of the royal family will be leading generals in their own empire. This becomes such a tradition that many Byzantine emperors will now meet their fate on the battlefield. And in fact, the last Byzantine emperor, Constantine XI, will die defending Constantinople in 1453 in the midst of a ferocious battle against the Ottomans. So this will become part and parcel of what it means to be a Byzantine emperor, is the ability to lead your men into battle. Maurice made one other great contribution to Byzantine institutional history when he decided to create the exarchates of Ravenna and Carthage. Now, an exarchate is a government which combines the military and civilian authority under one official, who would be basically the governor, or to use the Byzantine term, exarch. And the reason for him creating this is that he saw that in these constant state of emergencies in these regions, that you needed an official who had full autonomy, or close to full autonomy, and didn't have to seek imperial approval or deal with a colleague who controlled other aspects of the same job. So, on the one hand, this does lessen imperial authority, but it does mean that if you have a good exarch, they can act swiftly and resolve problems more efficiently. So this is a pragmatic measure, but it does create a potential danger in that you can have an exarch who can ingratiate himself with the locals and has control of the military. So if you had say a really ambitious exarch, that person could be a rival. He could break away from you or declare himself emperor and have a local following to try to wage a civil war. This problem doesn't emerge too much, but the danger is certainly there. Maurice's creation of the two exarchates in the West are no doubt driven by his appreciation for the severity of the problems in the West. So in Spain, we see that the Visigothic kings are slowly reconquering Spania. Maurice does not respond to that problem, possibly because he saw that the situation was already lost, or possibly because he just didn't care about Spain, or maybe he just didn't have the resources. It's not really clear. He could look at Africa and see that there was a constant attack from the Berbers, and that this was really hampering prosperity. Around this time, Africa, meaning mostly Tunisia to put it in modern terms, was starting to decline economically and agriculturally. So under the Carthaginians and then the Romans, Tunisia had basically been a breadbasket for the ancient world. It had some of the most fertile soil anywhere on Earth. But this is starting to give way to desertification around the time of Maurice. So the prosperity and harvest yields there are going down. This could be caused by any number of factors, maybe from centuries of expecting that land to yield multiple harvests, possibly from climate change and a change in rainfall patterns, especially far inland, away from the Mediterranean. raiding. I mean, there's a lot of things that could play into that. And in Italy, the Lombards are reorganized. So for a while, they had fallen into a bit of a civil war. I'll have a whole video on that up later. And they had become disorganized. However, they have a king named Othari, who comes to power in 584, and he's able to reunify and get the Lombards back on the right path. And after that, they pose a major threat to the surviving Byzantine territories. And this creates more problems for the Byzantines, and they continue to lose ground. In addition, the popes are not only trying to separate themselves on an ecclesiastical level, as we explored in earlier videos, but they also are trying to create a political independence, and Pope Gregory the Great actually sort of takes a baby step in that direction by making a treaty independent of the Byzantines with the Lombards. Now, ultimately, the Byzantines will acquiesce to this treaty and intervene to make sure that the Lombards keep their part of the bargain, but this is the first step away from the Byzantines and towards an independent papal policy. Later on, they will break away entirely and not really cooperate that much with the Byzantines, but that's still some ways off. So if Maurice was no longer on the Persian front and he wasn't handling the problems out west in person, then what was he doing? We know he's not a palace prince, he's a guy who commands in the field, and where he was fighting for pretty much his entire reign was in the Balkans. And his opponents there are the Avars and Slavs, who we'll get into in more detail next week. For now, suffice to say that these two powers would work together for the most part. The Avars were the senior partner, and they would provide the mounted troops, whereas the Slavs were more or less a subordinate people of the Avars at first, and would serve as infantry. Because Sirmium had fallen right around the time that he was taking power from Tiberius II, some scholars actually think it happened on his watch rather than Tiberius's, but it's not really 100% clear. This means that Maurice is trying to keep the Balkans free of invasion for the entire 20 years or so of his career. So if you're wondering where Maurice was at any given time, he would be somewhere between, I don't know, like modern Bosnia and Constantinople, and maybe he was as far north as modern Romania. So that's where he was pretty much that entire period, moving back and forth on campaign. In 590, there was a complicated palace coup in Persia, and the end result is that the 20-year-old Chosroes II fled to Constantinople to seek the support of Maurice. He claimed that the person who kicked him off the throne that had been held by his father and grandfather was a usurper, and that he required Maurice's assistance. In return, of course, he said that he could do things to help Maurice. Maurice likes the sound of that, so he sends armies, and they put Chosroes back on the throne of Persia. And the two rulers agree to an eternal peace in the year 591. This peace obviously does not prove to be eternal, as is usually the case with peace agreements. Now, Byzantium, under this agreement, will gain large tracts of Armenia. That was a territory that the two powers have been fighting over for many decades by this point. Actually, a couple centuries, going back to Rome and the Parthian Empire, the predecessor for the Sasanian Persian Empire. Basically, Maurice did all this to gain time and resources to concentrate on his ongoing efforts in the Balkans, where he would now double down, and he vastly underestimated Chosroes II and his ambitions. So ultimately, this play would help Maurice for about a decade, but would then come back to bite his successors pretty hard, which is kind of fitting when you think about the fact that Maurice was overthrown by a usurper. Due to his great reputation from his time as commander-in-chief on the Persian front, and due to the influence he held with Chosroes II after he helped restore him to the throne of Persia, Maurice was able to really dictate terms in the east to a great extent, and he was able to arrange frontier affairs how he saw fit. So, on the one hand, if you look at the northern frontier, where there were allies of both sides,
he was able to gain the upper hand, and his reign marks the high water mark of Byzantine authority in the Caucasus. This is a steady improvement from the end of the Lazark War, and now pretty much all of the tribes in that region would be much more inclined to fight for Byzantium than for Persia. If we go south and look at Arabia, we see that Maurice's diplomacy enabled him to have dealings with Arabs beyond just the Ghassanid Empire, which had been a client kingdom of the Byzantines for a couple centuries by this point, and he was able to use this increased flexibility and influence as a deterrent against Persian aggression. After all, if you control all of, or at least the majority of, the nomadic groups to the north and the south of the frontiers of the main empire, then the Persians decide to attack Byzantium, then you can get your allies to strike them in the rear and do a lot of damage through raids. So basically, Maurice's arrangements in the east meant that he really had the Persians by the short hairs. They couldn't really attack him without exposing their flanks to massive raiding from the people to their north and south, who they had previously been protected from because they would have their own client kingdoms there to fight against them. You see the Lakhmid kingdom right there. That was a Persian client state. We'll talk more about that when we get to Persia, and then next week when we talk about the Arabs. If you need any further evidence of the extent of Maurice's vision, then this incident should provide it. In 597, Maurice was seriously ill, and it looked like the end was near, so he drew up his plans for succession to the throne. Now, his succession plan was to give the empire of the east, meaning the Balkans and then the Mesopotamian frontier in Egypt, to his oldest son, Theodosius, and then give his second son, whose name I can't recall, control of the west, meaning the two exarchates and Spain. So basically, if the sources are to be believed, he wanted to revive the Western Empire to some extent. And it also looks like he might have tried to involve his other two sons in the government in some way. However, this plan never went into action because Maurice didn't die in 597. He made a full recovery and got back to doing what he did best, which was commanding armies in the field. Aside from creating the exarchates and for setting a tradition of Byzantine emperors as generals in the field, a tradition which lasted for 900 years, Maurice is also famous for writing a work called the Strategikon, which is a military manual and a source which is very important for ancient and medieval military historians. Now, one of the most famous recommendations that Maurice makes is that unreliable mercenaries should be replaced with local peasant militias. He believes that these troops are less likely to mutiny and that they are generally more reliable. Not only that, they'd also be cheaper. This will be a description that will take on special significance when we find out how Maurice dies. He also provides lots of interesting ethnographic information. So we learn a lot about the Lombards, the Slavs, the Avars, and other groups from Maurice. And that's actually where a lot of our information on these groups comes from, since some of these groups had limited or no writing at this time. And another thing that is relevant to Maurice's career is that his recommended tactic for dealing with the Slavs is to attack them during the winter. And we'll see that his last campaign was attempting to do exactly that. Late in the year 602, Maurice ordered his army to winter north of the Danube, and he returned home to Constantinople. He wanted to rejoin his army early in the spring and resume his campaign as quickly as possible in order to follow up on some of the gains that he had made against the Slavs and Avars. He had been crossing the Danube for several years at that point and inflicting damage on them and their home territories, and he thought he was on the verge of winning a major and lasting victory. Again, in his Strategikon, he said that the best time to attack the Slavs is during the winter, so he was just following his own advice. Now, this is something that was highly unusual, this idea of wintering away from the permanent bases that had been established on the frontier. These permanent bases had been the places where Roman and Byzantine armies had been sheltering for winter since the time of Augustus.
it was a normal job expectation that you would be able to live in relative comfort over the winter in places that are permanent structures and not tents. And one significant factor is that during this period, the 6th, 7th century, things were colder than they were in previous periods. The classical optimum had ended, so winters could get pretty bitter, especially when you're north of the Danube. So there are a lot of soldiers who are kind of pissed off about this. There's the general discontent of people in general in this time, and then you also have just the fact that soldiers are looking at a long, bitter winter in hostile territory without the protection of their normal camp's walls and the warmth of their normal cots or beds or whatever they were sleeping in. So the soldiers are a powder keg, and eventually there's a minor general in the camp named Phocas who says that he's going to lead the men home and that they're going to sleep in their own beds. So the army follows Phocas and they begin marching back to Constantinople. As Phocas and the mutineers are marching back to the capital, it occurs to them that if they are captured by Maurice, that some of them will be executed and others will be punished severely. So they need to have a cause they can hold up as their reason for this mutiny to make themselves the righteous party and the party that was aggrieved. So they announced their intention to depose Maurice, saying he was a bad emperor, and they said that they were going to put his eldest son, Theodosius, in power. Theodosius was probably an adult by this point and may have had some experience of his own, so this didn't seem like a completely unreasonable thing. And it also didn't look like they were trying to intervene too much in dynastic politics, merely standing up for their own interest, something that had been done in the past and was not super controversial. I mean, granted, it's always controversial, but this wasn't something that was completely out of keeping with army traditions. Now, the thing that really complicated this mutiny is that at the same time, there was a major riot in Constantinople. The Blues and the Greens had put aside their own usual bickering and their constant back and forth murders of each other's membership, and they were united to riot because Maurice had passed a lot of regulations against their activities, and they weren't having it. They wanted autonomy. They wanted to self-regulate, and Maurice disagreed with their views. Now, surprisingly, you would think that most senators, who are pretty much the richest people in the city, would be all for law and order and keeping the Blues and the Greens in their place. However, there are a lot of ambitious senators who, for whatever reason, really did not like Maurice. So they actually supported the riots and sided with the Blues and the Greens. So before Phocas can even get to the city, the rioters actually storm the palace and they capture Maurice and his 4 sons and kill all of them, and they also execute Maurice's wife, if I'm not mistaken. So when Phocas arrives, there is no emperor because he's dead, there are no obvious heirs, and at this point Phocas has the most troops under his command, so he's proclaimed the emperor. The rioters think that they are his allies, and the Senate approves of this action. This is a picture of an artist rendition of what this might have looked like. You see the heads on the spikes. The longest spike is for Maurice himself. So, interestingly enough, the first soldier emperor of the Byzantines was executed by his own men, effectively, for his policies. Yeah, sort of a sad way to go out, especially looking at how great his legacy actually was. So let's assess the contributions of Maurice to the Byzantine Empire. So, first and foremost, he was a good general. That was sort of his background. That's why he was in the office in the first place. And he's also an important historical source that has to count in his favor. He's a pretty pragmatic problem solver. His creation of the exarchate system shows that. He didn't necessarily see through all the potential consequences, but he did create a fairly lasting arrangement. The exarchate of Ravenna would survive beyond the fall of Ravenna, in the sense that there were Byzantine territories which remained in Italy for a very long time. The last of them were not eliminated until the 11th century. And he had a pretty solid vision overall for foreign policy. His Eastern arrangement was pretty smart, and it looked like he was on the cusp of achieving something lasting in the Balkans. So, had he taken care of business in other areas as effectively or reasonably effectively, he would have gone down as one of the great Byzantine emperors. However, he paid insufficient detail to popular military and elite discontent in his empire, and that ultimately cost him his throne and his life. One job of an emperor is to be reasonably popular. Your palace guard is pretty effective, however, in the age before machine guns and tear gas and electrified fences and other modern technology which makes a small number of well-equipped people able to hold off a horde, there's only so much that a well-armored, well-trained guy with an axe or a sword can do if he's faced with an entire mob. You have to have room around you to wield your weapons, so a well-armed bodyguard can be overwhelmed by sheer numbers. And if you don't have the population on your side and you live in a confined area like a city, then you need to have the population on your side to some extent to prevent them from overthrowing you. Because physically speaking, they are perfectly capable of doing that, provided that they are sufficiently angry. You also need the military to be on your side, especially if you're going to command them in the field. There are plenty of occasions in earlier Roman history and a couple in Byzantine history where discontent soldiers will assassinate an emperor, or even just a general, for some slight or because they feel the general is unnecessarily endangering them. Had Maurice been present with his army north of the Danube, it's possible that the mutiny there might have resulted in his death away from home. And also, it's sort of interesting that he didn't have the support of the elite either. The thing about having elite support is that their support is always fickle because they have their own ambitions, and it can be hard to gauge where you stand with them. So if you really want their support, you don't actively alienate them, and you make sure that you have reasonable support among the population and the military so that the elite have nowhere to go to find a backing for their personal ambitions. And while his Persian intervention in the short term and the medium term was a pretty brilliant move, and it would have succeeded really well had he been able to continue his career and then pass his empire on peacefully to his sons, it fell apart because of the usurpation of Phocas. Now, not surprisingly, the Persian king Chosroes II was able to claim a special sense of kinship with Maurice, since Maurice had helped restore him to his throne, and he intervened in Roman affairs, or Byzantine affairs, claiming that, hey, I am trying to set things right by dealing with this usurper Phocas and, bringing justice back to the Roman Empire. And that led to the most devastating war in Byzantine history, the Byzantine-Sasanian War of 602 to 628, something that we'll discuss next week. In this video, I want to look at the life and times of the controversial and almost always reviled Emperor Phocas, who ruled from 602 to 610. All the ancient sources are entirely hostile to him, and most modern scholars are willing enough to follow suit. After all, he murdered Maurice, who was a successful emperor on the verge of achieving possibly a lasting settlement in the Balkans, and also the author of one of the most important works of that period, the Strategicon. And on the other hand, Phocas himself was overthrown by Heraclius, who was almost always considered to be one of the great heroes of Byzantine history. So because he is the guy who falls in between two of the most beloved figures in the eyes of modern scholars, most people are more than happy to ascribe the blame for the disasters which befell Byzantium in the Byzantine-Sasanian War of 602 to 628 and take those disasters and lay them on the shoulders of Phocas. So what the sort of underlying question of this video, therefore, is Phocas as much of a failure as he's made out to be by sources both modern and ancient, or is he really more of a victim of propaganda who happened to not really live long enough to establish his legitimacy and make a case for himself? Well, let's take a look at his career and we can try to answer that question. Like almost all usurpers in Roman and Byzantine history, the details about the life of Phocas are relatively obscure. We can pretty much gather that he's a career officer in the Byzantine army, and he was probably fairly high ranking by the time he came to power in 602. We know that he was 53 years of age, and he seems to have had no children, which might indicate that he was unmarried. It's not really clear. However, the sources do at one point call him a minor general. That is a questionable assertion, given that he was selected by his men as their representative, and they would obviously want the person with the most prestige and distinction that they could find. So it does imply that Phocas was a reasonably well-known figure. We also know from later that many senators were willing to cast their lot behind him, which also indicates that he had more prestige than our sources tend to let on. However, keep in mind that it is possible that he actually was a minor general. Maurice tended to command in person. Of course, Maurice famously is the first emperor to do that since Theodosius back in the late 4th century. And what that means is when the emperor is commanding the main field army, the opportunities to really gain distinction as a commander are fairly limited. So we can't say for sure, but I'm actually willing to guess that in one way or another, Phocas was a reasonably distinguished guy prior to his accession to the imperial throne. After the campaigning season for 502 had ended, Maurice left his army north of the Danube and ordered them to winter there. Now, that was a really unusual order. The Romans had frontier forts on the south side of the Danube, and they were accustomed to spending the winters there. They had provisions there, they had fortifications, they were safe, they were a lot warmer than they would be, further north and without these permanent camps. So this was something that was not popular with the army. And if we look at Maurice's Strategicon, he often said that the best time to attack Slavs was during the winter. So maybe his thought was that if the Byzantines held out over winter, that would prevent the Slavs from getting better organized, and then he would return with more troops, and they could launch a major campaign north of the Danube and hopefully achieve something. However, the army didn't really share Maurice's view. They were much more concerned with their own lives and their own, comfort and survival. So, therefore, they mutinied since they felt like they had been abused by Maurice and that he was asking too much. And when they mutinied, they ended up selecting Phocas as their leader and representative. And based on the available information, which is fairly scanty, we don't know if Phocas was a catalyst for the mutiny or whether he was sort of forced to take control by the people leading the mutiny. And we also don't really know whether he originally intended to become emperor or whether he was lodging a protest or exactly what his intentions were. However, generally speaking, any general who would put himself at the head of a mutiny was a marked man. So I'm actually of the opinion that once Phocas started leading the army south of the Danube and marching on the capital, that he had every intention of eliminating Maurice and Maurice's family and taking control. Otherwise, he at best would have been exiled, but more likely would have been straight up executed. When Maurice and his mutineers arrived in Constantinople, they found the situation was already volatile. Maurice's crackdown of the activities of the Blues and the Greens had led to the worst rioting since the Nika riots of 532, and the people there were ready to get rid of Maurice. And there were a lot of senators who were willing to go along with that. Now, we don't know the exact numbers. We actually don't even know how many senators there even were by this point. It looks like the Senate was not at the full 600 that it had been in the late Roman Republic by any stretch. So at least some of these senators are willing to back Phocas to help him get legitimacy. And it's not really all that clear how Phocas ended up merging these two movements together, but it does imply that he has more political skills than we would normally think. The sources are pretty hostile to him. They make him out like he's just a murderer, an opportunist, and maybe, not the brightest guy in any room. So, but it looks like in this case he was able to capitalize on what was going on, and he managed to get the crowd and many senators behind him. And he, with the help of this crowd, was able to round up Maurice and his sons and execute all of them. That was actually after his initial claim that what he was going to do is march on the city and depose Maurice in favor of Maurice's eldest son, Theodosius. And that would come back to bite him in the ass later. Now, the women of the family are actually spared, as well as some other potential rivals like Germanus, the last surviving male of the line of Justinian, who had been a contender back when Maurice had first taken power in 582. So one of the sort of myths about Phocas is that he came into the city and immediately began a massacre. He actually really only eliminated Maurice and his 4 or so sons, and he tried to spare other people as much as possible. He did commit more murders later, but we'll see that those are somewhat justified if we look at the dangers that Phocas faced. And certainly, he's by no means among the elite butchers in Roman or Byzantine history. The primary beneficiary of Phocas's usurpation wasn't the Senate, it wasn't the Greens, it wasn't the Blues, and it wasn't even Phocas himself. The primary beneficiary was Chosroe II of Persia. Now, back in 590, at the age of 20, he had faced a civil war and he had had to flee to Byzantium and seek help from the Emperor Maurice. Maurice had then sent troops with Chosroe and helped put him on the throne. So for the last 12 years, Chosroe had been more or less seen as a puppet for Maurice and the Byzantines, because in the treaty they signed after he was installed as the Shahanshah of the Sasanian state, he had given up some territory to Byzantium. Well, now he can invade and try to regain that territory on the pretext that he's avenging his patron and friend, Maurice. So, as soon as he receives news of Phocas' usurpation, he files a formal complaint and begins invading across the Roman frontier in Mesopotamia, and also attacking the Roman holdings in Armenia. And a lot of this is driven by an internal need in his own land to sort of show all the nobles who might have contempt for him that, 1, he's a great warrior, and 2, he certainly is no puppet of the Byzantines. Now, from Phocas' perspective, this is probably yet another indecisive war that's going to begin. The Romans and Sasanians had shared a frontier for several centuries, and not really much progress had been made. Actually, if you date this back to the Roman Empire and the Parthian Empire, they had shared a border since about 65 BCE, and there hadn't been a lot of major changes one way or the other, and most of the major changes that had happened had only kept for a short amount of time and had more or less always favored the Romans. So, if you're Phocas, this is a crisis to be sure, but it by no means looks like any kind of existential threat. And while there are some early victories for the Persians that are unusual, they actually take some of the fortified cities that almost never fall, like Dara, this isn't something that's completely unprecedented. Now, sure, the Romans tended to have the advantage in these wars, but they lost a few of them too, and they also lost some battles here and there and some campaigns. So far, this is nothing unusual. While Phocas started out his reign being popular with the Senate and the people at Constantinople, that doesn't necessarily mean that all of the officials of the empire were loyal to him. After all, while Maurice was not all that popular in the city of Constantinople, obviously they, strung him up, so he couldn't have been popular at all. He had ruled for 20 years, and during that time he had promoted a lot of key officials around the empire, from the exarchs in the west to many of the major generals on the eastern frontier. So it looks like most of the discontent was concentrated in the capital and in the Balkan armies, which Maurice had been using as a bludgeon against the Avars and Slavs. So at this point, there are many officials who thought that Maurice was wronged, and they're fairly open to cooperating with Persia. There's a general in the east named Narses, not to be confused with the famous eunuch general under Justinian, and he actually claims that he has custody of Maurice's oldest son, Theodosius,
and that Theodosius had been visiting the eastern frontier at the time when Maurice's family was eliminated in the capital. So Narses refused to obey orders from the capital and corresponded with Chosroe about what to do and how to restore Theodosius. And once this rumor about Theodosius' survival spreads, Chosroe jumps in and says that he is actually going to do for Theodosius what Maurice did for him. Now, because there was, an obvious motive on the part of both Phocas and later Heraclius to say that Theodosius was fake, the sources are not very clear on whether this Theodosius was a genuine son of Maurice or an impostor. But again, there was an obvious agenda. If you're Phocas, you want to say, no, this is a pretender. There are no more line of Maurice potential rulers. And if you're Heraclius, you don't want to sully the fact that you ended the tyranny of Phocas by, having a legitimate heir out there somewhere who is, being deprived of power because of you. So that is why this controversy was never really settled. And there were Byzantine garrisons who, when the Persian army would arrive and have, their Theodosius with them, the garrisons would sometimes simply give up immediately and happily embrace this, pretender, or maybe he was the prince, who knows. And that is actually why the Persians were able to really pierce a frontier that was, centered around these fortified cities that are very difficult to take even with the best siege equipment. So this is part of the reason why Phocas's position deteriorated the way that it did. Meanwhile, back in Constantinople, Phocas lost his initial popularity and he began to be the target of conspiracies. Now, naturally, whenever you're the ruler and someone tries to kill you, if you survive, you retaliate by killing them. So that's what Phocas did. And any time in either Roman or Byzantine history, when you harm a senator, even if they deserve it, and then you don't live to write the history, then you're portrayed as being a savage. There's a lot of evidence that the famous Emperor Caligula was actually completely sane. He was just someone who hated the Senate, and because he hated the Senate, all the sources written by senators were extraordinarily hostile and portrayed him as being a lunatic. Because that was the only way you could possibly hate the Senate, is if you're, a crazy person, right? I mean, there's no way a sane person could hate a bunch of pretentious aristocrats who want to plot against you and undermine you. Anyway, so back to Phocas. I don't find his actions to be all that unusual, and he never went beyond the group of conspirators, so he didn't take one conspiracy as then evidence that he needed to eliminate any potential rival. So there was eventually there was a conspiracy by the wife of Maurice, and he dealt with that conspiracy. And there was a conspiracy involving Germanus, and maybe this was the same conspiracy with Maurice's wife, and so he dealt with Germanus. So he did have suspicions of a lot of people around him, and he did express those suspicions, but he didn't always enact them unless he had good evidence. So if anything, Phocas was fairly typical in this regard, and it does deserve some commendation that he didn't go completely off the deep end. Now, that being said, obviously, if he were a better politician, this would not be necessary at all, because he would have managed to build up and maintain enough support that he wouldn't have been the target of conspiracies in the first place. So while Phocas's position in Constantinople was becoming increasingly untenable, the position on the eastern frontier was also deteriorating slowly but surely over the 8 years of his reign. The Sasanians were slowly but surely gaining ground and taking major cities in Mesopotamia. So there were a lot of failures on Phocas's watch. He also decided to restore the payment of subsidies to the Avars and Slavs in order to purchase their neutrality. and that enabled him to remove troops from the Balkans and send them to the east. Now, this move has been criticized because it gave the Avars and Slavs a bunch of time to reorganize themselves and to become a threat after Maurice had really pounded them into near submission. So that is one of the long-term consequences of Phocas's reign, is that by murdering Maurice and ending the offensive in the Balkans, he really enabled the Slavs and Avars to prosper and continue to pose a major threat to Byzantium. As domestic unrest against Phocas continued to increase and to spread to members of the upper class, some of their members began to reach out to prominent generals and governors looking for an alternative and a way to get rid of this now deeply unpopular emperor. Phocas's own number 2 man, Priscus, had been accused by Phocas himself of being privy to one or more of the conspiracies that had been laid against him. And Priscus knew that there was always a possibility that when you're suspected of treason, you could have your head lopped off without, any proof. So up to that point, Priscus had been loyal and hadn't even been a part of any of this, so far as we know. But then he was spooked, and he contacted Heraclius, the Exarch of Africa. Now, in theory, the Exarch of Italy would be a better option because Italy was a more powerful province with more troops. However, Africa was still fairly powerful, and it was not engaged in a war against the Lombards, so the troops were able to actually leave Africa and do other things at times. So the elder Heraclius was someone who we don't know all that much about, aside from the fact that he was most likely appointed by Maurice and may have had some history as a general on the Eastern Front before he was appointed Exarch. So Heraclius has a son also named Heraclius, who's about 30 or a little bit more. And while the elder Heraclius is a bit long in the tooth to be making war, his son is just reaching his prime and, is eager and willing. So the two of them come up with a strategy to try to depose Phocas. Now, the younger Heraclius and his generals then go and launch an attack on Egypt. And that's actually a very smart move because Constantinople was dependent upon grain from Egypt to stay fed, and this was a city with a very large population that could not be supplied with sufficient grain from local sources. So all of that discontent against Phocas is now really amped up. And people don't blame Heraclius for causing this discontent, they blame Phocas for not being able to deal with it. So it ends up working well. And as he hears that the tension is getting worse and that rioting is really intensifying, the worse it's been since Phocas came in and killed Maurice, Heraclius decides to make a bold move and sail right into Constantinople. He actually has fewer ships than Phocas, but Phocas's men aren't really that loyal, and doing a naval interception is actually not that easy. So Phocas is handed over by the mob. They just go to his palace and grab him when they hear that Heraclius is in the harbor. And before Heraclius even sets foot in the city, Phocas is brought to his ship. They have a dramatic confrontation where Heraclius more or less has to give a reason for killing Phocas. Basically, you govern like a tyrant and you were terrible. And Phocas challenges him by asking if he will govern any better. Now, because of the high reputation that Heraclius generally has from a lot of modern historians and in the sources, you would think that this is a silly question. However, when I eventually make my video on Heraclius, we'll see that for a lot of Heraclius' early career, especially the first 12 years, it looked like he was on a path to be as bad or even worse than Phocas in terms of his ability to deal with Byzantium's problems. So now that we've looked at Phocas' career, I'd like to revisit the question that I asked at the beginning. Is Phocas simply a failure, or is he someone who is more a victim of propaganda? I am going to say he is both. As an emperor, your jobs are to keep domestic peace and defend your borders. Those are your two major jobs. And Phocas sucked at both of those jobs. His decisions empowered potential enemies in the West who would then harm the Empire after he was gone, and he failed to contain the threat in the East. At the same time, he never really established a secure power base, and he had to spend most of his time staying in power by defending himself from conspiracies. He never went far enough in either suppressing any potential dissent or in trying to appease potential opponents. He never really had a strategy that worked. So, pretty bad emperor on an objective level. However, he did inherit quite a few of these problems from Maurice. Now, while Maurice was a good general and someone who clearly had a lot of vision when it came to foreign policy, obviously it looks like if Maurice had lived, he might have done quite a bit of good for the Byzantine position in the Balkans. But he neglected domestic affairs, and that's ultimately what cost him his life. And, Phocas was not able to deal with that either. He was able to capitalize on Maurice's incompetence at the domestic level to take power, but it was a problem that he could not solve. So it was a problem which brought him down as well. Another thing to note is that in the Roman and Byzantine empires, establishing legitimacy is tricky. If we're keeping it completely 100, a Roman or Byzantine emperor is a military dictator. That is fundamentally what they are. However, they want to appear to be something more. By the time of Phocas, and especially this becomes much more explicit with Heraclius, these emperors are expected to sort of be Christ's vicar on earth. They're expected to be the leader of the Christian community. So they're expected to really solve any and all issues. They're expected to have great wisdom. They're expected to have great bravery. Maurice and Heraclius really set the standard for the kinds of risk and personal dangers that emperors are expected to expose themselves to. And it wasn't really clear that Maurice's example was going to be the new standard. After all, he was the first guy who had done it in 300 years, and Phocas was kind of reverting to the old model of staying in the palace and managing everything centrally, which, in this new time of trials and tribulations was not going to be sufficient. Now, I would also point out that because Phocas was able to successfully usurp a sitting emperor, and that he did this with the support of the army and the people, and it wasn't just a palace coup that he pulled off in secret, this does mean that he must have been popular, and that he more or less was the people's choice. So he was not really a tyrant in a meaningful way, at least by the standards of his own day. However, by taking over, he did act fairly irresponsibly, since the events that he set in motion ended up being disasters for his empire. And at the bare minimum, even if we can't give him full credit for messing up the situation in the East, Heraclius starting a second civil war might have been what really put it over the top, arguably. He definitely undid almost everything that Maurice had accomplished in the Balkans, and Maurice had spent about 10 years on that problem. So, that was quite a bit of work undone, and it was also work which required a militarily capable emperor, and those don't really tend to come along super often. So, overall, his policies were a failure, and the empire was worse for having him in command. His performance against Persia was inadequate, but you could also make the case that he was facing an unprecedented crisis. As I said earlier, there was no way to know that this invasion would be one that almost destroyed the entire Byzantine state. Certainly, the Byzantines had never faced a danger like this before, and it would be pretty rare, even in their long and brutal history, that they would face another threat of such magnitude. So I would also point out that Phocas is one of the first emperors in what later became known as the Byzantine Dark Ages, where we have few historical texts, and most of the texts we do have are written 100 or 200 years later. So if you look at a source like Theophanes the Confessor, we're talking about a historian who's writing in the wake of 6 Heraclean emperors.
So there were 4 real Heraclean emperors who ruled for several years, did things, passed the empire on to an heir, and died. And they had an impact on history. And they also, therefore, had an impact on how history was remembered. And they don't want Heraclius to go down as a usurper, so they have to really paint Phocas in a black light in order to make Heraclius a savior rather than a warmonger. So a lot of what we know about Phocas is heavily biased, and while it's very hard just looking at what happened to make it out that he was anything other than a bad emperor, but he most likely is not nearly as bad as he's made out in the sources. So that would be my answer to the question that I posed earlier. Next time, we'll take a look at Heraclius.